Raise your hand if you've heard someone respond to a question by saying, you should Google it. Okay. Keep your hands raised if you have responded to a question by saying, you should Google it. Yeah, most of us in this room, me included, are guilty of this phenomenon. In the information age, anything we could ever want to know is quite literally in the palm of our hands, thanks to smartphones. But if you're an elder millennial like me, and yes, that is a real term, you remember a time before the internet when you couldn't pass the buck to a question onto a search engine. You remember a time when asking a question could change your life. I was born and raised in rural Northwest Ohio and went to school in the same building for my K through 12 years. My family was extremely poor financially, but rich in so many other ways. My ancestors hail from Central America and Spain, so growing up, I was surrounded by vibrant music, language, self-expression, and food. But when I entered the local school system, I was slowly confronted with lived experiences that I couldn't wrap my young mind around. For example, I wondered why some of my peers lived in houses with their own bedrooms, while the 5 of us barely fit into a double-wide trailer. I also wondered why some of my peers referred to some of us as dirty Mexicans. I bathed every day, so what about me was dirty, I wondered. The junior high years were rough, but when high school started, I had to meet with the high school counselor to talk about my post-high school plans. I was taken aback one day when she asked if I ever thought about college. Although both my parents encouraged education, neither one had any experience with college or university. So at best, it was a dream, and at worst, out of the question. Well, yeah, I said to my counselor, but I don't know how I'm gonna pay for it. I don't have the money, and my parents don't have it either. That was okay, she assured me. There are programs and scholarships for students with my background, and she would set up visits for me to find out for myself. Cool, I thought, anything to get out of this small town. It was the early 2000s, on the heels of the 90s, an era of multicultural representation and girl power. I spent my after-school hours watching All That, which featured a multi-ethnic and racial cast, or paging through the teen magazines that venerated boys, girls, women, men that looked nothing like me. But I do remember feeling seen when Edward James Olmos, playing Selena Quintanilla's father in the 1997 film about her life, stated that being Mexican American is hard. We have to be twice as perfect to be accepted by either side of the border because our ancestral homeland is right next to the United States. The school counselor arranged for my cousin Daniela and I, who was a year ahead of me in high school, to go on the college visit together. She informed us that it was an overnight diversity recruiting event at Wright State University. I was in 10th grade, both excited and nervous, but ready for the adventure. When we arrived, we were greeted by students who showed us to the dorms we would be staying in. While settling in, I was beginning to become very overwhelmed and self-conscious. You see, it was at that very moment that I realized this was the first time in my life that I was interacting with anybody from the Black community. Although I knew beloved characters like Laura Winslow in Family Matters or Hilary Banks in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, I also knew these were fictional characters and unable to have an actual conversation with. And yet, here I was in real life with a young woman opening her living space to me, and I didn't feel like I had any idea how to interact with her. So I did something incredibly vulnerable. I asked a question. I prefaced my question by stating that what I was about to ask might be offensive, but that I was asking from a genuine place of curiosity because she was the first Black person I had ever met in my life. That led to my question. Do I say Black or African American when referring to her and her peers? She smiled and explained to me that she preferred Black, but that I might meet people that would prefer African American. I let out a sigh of relief, and she followed up with her own question. What was my background? Mexican, I said, and began to tell her stories about the things my mom shared with me about both grandparents on either side. Oh, she exclaimed, you're Black. The confused look on my face must have tipped her off because she continued, look, your people have a similar story of struggle in this country. So as far as I'm concerned, you're Black. And while I did not understand then exactly what she was referring to, I was grateful that she held space for me and my ignorance, which I can now recognize she was not required to do whatsoever. But I'm glad she did, despite me committing that what many of us in academia today might quickly characterize as a microaggression. I study higher education administration and am deeply interested in the history of post-secondary institutions, how they were created, maintained, and challenged in the United States. At best, higher education institutions function as a microcosm of society, as an incubator for our democracy, because in an ideal situation, it brings people from across generations and all backgrounds to interact and be in community with one another while we try to solve the world's problems. And at its worst, it functions as a form of schooling where individuals get pushed through a system and onto a job without very much time and space to think about themselves, let alone others. This contributes to a society hyper-fixated on individual success and quick information to get onto the next task and the next task, and certainly without asking difficult questions along the way. So I want us all to think about my college visit story and that interaction. Think about what you might do tomorrow if you were put in the same situation as me or that young woman. Would you be vulnerable enough to ask the question? And on the flip side, would you be patient enough to offer the answer? And maybe it's not race or ethnic identity. Maybe it's religious identity. Maybe it's gender identity or sexual orientation. Maybe it's other invisible identities that are not so obvious. And it's okay if you don't know how you would react. We are all, after all, human beings and susceptible to avoiding conversations that make us uncomfortable. But I also do not think it is healthy for our common humanity or democracy to rely on cell phones and Googling questions for the sake of simply finding an answer, period. I would challenge us all to think about what it means to have information and the humanity of someone's story. For me, that is what differentiates education from schooling. Sure, I received schooling from a K-12 system, but it wasn't until I was forced to face someone different than my own community and face my own ignorance and had an enlightened experience. And I want to be very clear about that interaction back in 10th grade. A stranger planted the seeds that would be watered, tilled, and harvested over the next 2 decades. When provided class options to fulfill the diversity requirement at my undergraduate studies later at Kent State University, I noticed there were no options to learn about Mexican history, but saw there was a class on the Black experience in the United States. That class changed my life, and it pushed me to learn my own history. As a result, I learned about Chicana identity in the school walkout movement. I learned about the Bracero program, which is the reason my ancestors were able to enter the United States. I learned about the Brown Berets who modeled their activism after the Black Panthers. I learned that I was just as much a part of the American democratic story as anyone else. And it was all because a young college student who I had just met was bold enough to see my story in her own before I ever did. I was given the gift of empathy. And now I try every day in my own work and scholarship to extend that empathy that was once extended to me in 10th grade. The information available to all of us fits in a small rectangular object that projects flashing images, and quick sound bites that are designed to elicit a reaction and a like or a share. It's pure information. And while it can be useful in some ways, it's also at a distance. This is what Dr. Gabriel A. Cruz, BGSU alum and professor of media studies at North Carolina Central University, refers to as proximity versus positionality. Proximity is what we experience when we engage with content online. We can be near stories and ideas that we would have not otherwise ever been exposed to. But it's our positionality, meaning those identities we hold or do not hold, that expand our understanding or limit our understanding. Questions and genuine curiosity should be encouraged in a democracy. If a system of government is for the whole of a people, then we ought to do our best to operate from a place that expands the pool of who gets to be part of that whole. And part of that expansion is access to classrooms that expose us to the history of those who do and do not look like us. But it's not enough to simply have information and historical facts about one another. We must also have each other's histories and personal stories, the joys, the pains, the messiness and betweenness of it all that makes us beautiful, chaotic human beings. Exchange of information should not be a means to an end, but rather as a connection that expands our humanity and civic identity, both within ourselves and for others. Thank you.